Yeah, so Stephanie just showed us a lot of background about what went into making the lightning design system. So I'm going to actually use those techniques to show how you go about using it to build something. So you guys are obviously familiar with the autocomplete Typeahead component. It's kind of a nice alternative to a drop down. You get a text box, you start typing. It looks for that text, the substring of some larger list, and returns the results in real time. It's been around for a while. We kind of take it for granted now. But if you go to Lightning Design System, you can see they've actually got their own take on that one. So, lightningdesignsystem.com, components, and there's a component in here called a Lookup. And this, Stephanie mentioned this is pure CSS. There's no JavaScript hooked up to this. So you can kind of look and see, what would it look like to have sort of a Typeahead component. And you can type in this thing, but it doesn't do anything. But you can see, this is what it looks like when you're searching. This is what it looks like when you found something. So you can see this single select. It's actually matched something that you found. And you've got this little checkbox to clear it. So if you look at this HTML and CSS that they give you, you can kind of see what you would need to make this yourself. So what I've done is I've just kind of wired this up, inserted it in a Lightning component, and wired it up to some database with some JavaScript. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the Lightning experience. And what I've done is I've created an app that has a Lightning component tab called Lookup Demo Page. So I'm going to kind of just go right to this thing and show you. So what we've got here is a Lightning component that implements Force App Hostable and has an icon to navigate to. It's kind of what you might think of as a Visual Force page in the old style of doing Salesforce development. But each one of these lookups is another Lightning component that's just inserted 4 times. So you can see I've got some text here telling what each one of these is doing. So this Typeahead lookup component, it's looking up on the contact object, and it's doing a client-side lookup, and it's using the starts with. So if you take a look and start typing, you can see we have Andy Young. But if we were just to type Young, it doesn't find a match. Whereas this one is also contact client-side, but it's using a contains. So if we start to type Young on this one, it'll actually find it. So that's some of the things you can do to kind of dial in the behavior you want for this lookup. When you select one of these, it changes to the close icon. So just like in Lightning Design, when you have a selected one, when you're searching for one, you get the magnifying glass. When you've selected one, you get close. So kind of replicated that behavior here. Also, there's a server-side lookup, which works the same way, but I'll show you when we get into the code. This is actually doing a SQL query on the back end every time you try to look something up. Whereas these client-side ones, they've actually preloaded all the records in the JavaScript object. And then, just to show you another object, this one is looking up the accounts. So, if I can remember a name of an account offhand. Oh, Burlington. So this is just a different object. So let's dig into the code and see what went into making this. So first of all, kind of that outer level component, I called it Look It Up. This is the one that has the Lightning component tab. It's pretty simple. It's including this Lightning autocomplete component 4 times. It's passing in these different options for client side, the object you want to look up, what field you're searching and returning, And then are you doing starts with or contains, true or false? So now let's look into the autocomplete component that's included in there. So first of all, I just want to mention the way you go about using the Lightning Design System. It's a static resource that you need to install, but Salesforce has actually given you an unmanaged package, so you can download it as a zip file, or you can just install this unmanaged package, which is what I did. Once you have that static resource in your org, you're going to want to use the Lightning required tag to load the CSS static resource. So once this is loaded, it's running this after scripts loaded do init event, and that's actually located in the controller. Let's take a look at that. So what do init is doing is, if you've passed in, you're doing client-side loading, it's going to get all those records. If you're doing server-side, it basically does nothing in the do init until you start typing. So this component here has all these attributes. It's got client server, starts with, object name. These ultimately actually get passed down to the Apex class level. We'll take a look at that. So also, we've got this event right here, this event handler. So when you actually find something here and click on it, this fires a choose event. So this is handling that right there. I'll show you more about how that bubbles up to the top. The other thing is we have two attributes, lookup val and lookup label. And what this does is when you select an autocomplete, it actually sets this to the Salesforce ID in the label that you pick. So you can use those. You know, maybe you pick something here and you want your app to update the database with the ID of this record. You can get those with these properties from the component. This list here is all available records. This is used only for the client-side lookup. So what we do is we just preload all the records in here, and we never have to load them again, and we just search through them as you do your autocomplete. That's just for the client-side lookup. This is the matched records. So as you're typing, if you're doing client-side, it's going to search through these and do your matched records. The beauty of this is this list right here is bound to all this UI stuff here. As these things change, the UI is automatically updated. So if you set this up, you don't have to do any work. Lightning handles it for you. So as you're typing these things, that list is getting updated, and this list is changing in real time, just from the Lightning's binding model. Okay, so the way I've done this is I've got two blocks here. I've got this one that renders when you have not chosen a record, and this one that renders when you have chosen a record. And so those are those two different modes. If we look here, back at the components, the lookup, we can see here's our state when we haven't chosen a record, here's the one when we have. This could be implemented different ways. You can just swap the CSS classes as well. I just kind of did the easiest thing, which is grabbing the whole block, and it swaps out whichever one it needs to render. So the other thing interesting here, Stephanie mentioned, was the SVG. So you can see this component SVG icon. To be able to display sprited SVGs, which are this little checkbox and this lookup, you have to actually create your own component. And there's information here on how to do that. So if you go to this icons, I believe, it says, you know, do this Lightning Helper component to use SVGs. So this tells you basically just copy and paste this code, and it creates this SVG component, which I did in my org, and then I'm calling it here to get those icons. The other piece of this is this aura iteration. So what this is doing is displaying all the records. What you can see is that it's calling another subcomponent. So we're like, this is the third level down. So let's take a look at that one really quick. So these are all the matches that the autocomplete returns. So the nice thing about putting this in its own component is that we're passing in the record to each instance of this component. So when you do select one, it knows what record it was on. So when you go to the JavaScript controller for this, you can see all you have to do is say component.get v.record, and it already knows, that it's one of these records. So, when this is its own component. This is its own component. When you click on it, it knows what record was loaded at the time. So that was the reason why I made that its own component. So when you click on that, it's actually going to fire this choose event, and the event stores the parameter of which record you clicked on, and then it's fired. So when you go back all the way up to this autocomplete component, and you can see we're handling that event, we can then look here, this is where the event is handled, and it sets this record chosen to true, which then automatically changes which block is rendered. So it renders this one here, the record's been chosen. So the other thing I want to point out on this is this Lightning component bundle. It's really nice the way it gives you the separate helper and controller file. So you can see a lot of this code is actually helper dot. And what that means is you can keep your controller pretty lean, and you can put a lot of reusable code in your helper. So let's take a look at the helper. So the two methods of getting the records that we have are get all records and server search. These take those parameters that you passed in, the object name, the search field, and they actually call Apex asynchronously in a controller that I'll show you, and they set that all records, which is in the component. Similarly, the server search, it actually calls Apex, but it passes in the search term. It's not getting all records, it's only getting a subset. So let's open up that Apex class. Okay, so here's our two methods, get all records and search records. Very simple. All this is doing is passing in an object name and a field. It always uses the ID as the value, and the search field could be anything, object name. So very simple SQL query, loops through. One interesting thing I'm doing here is I'm actually returning a two-dimensional string array. So instead of returning, you can see this thing could potentially go up to 50,000 objects. So instead of returning a large JSON payload which has the field names repeated over and over again, it's just using index locations, so it's a little bit smaller payload. It's a minor point, but it's a little bit. This method that searches the records, this is just using the SQL like. So if you say starts with, it's going to say my search term with a wildcard. If you're not doing starts with, it's going to put a wildcard before and after. So it's going to return that substring anywhere in the string. And that's also returning the two-dimensional string array. So the last thing I want to point out is the JavaScript that runs for the client-side search. client-side search takes the full list of all records and compares your text string. So anytime you type a character, well, okay, we actually have a variable here we can tweak, minimum characters. I set it to 1. You could set it to 2, 3. It gets a little expensive to just type the letter A and have it search for 1 character all the way through. So you could bump this up a little bit. But it checks to see if what you've typed via this text here, it takes that text and it looks to see if it's start with, is the index location in the beginning, or if it's not start with, is it just somewhere in there? If it is, it pushes it into this matched records array, and at the end it updates matched records. So that's a very simple way to write a lookup from scratch in JavaScript. If you listen to like Skip Sauls and Doug Chasman, they're talking about Lightning a lot, and they're saying try to build these things natively in JavaScript. Bring in your frameworks only if you have really good reason to, because there's a lot of overhead, things like jQuery. So this is kind of using that mentality of writing things and letting Lightning be your framework and not using another framework. It also gives you the ability to do some really granular things like, do you want to be case sensitive or not? Do you want to do some additional filtering? So you kind of have full control. And you can, this takes a few parameters, such as the starts with. The sky's the limit in terms of the parameters you can pass into this. Then the server-side search is a little more simple. It's basically just taking everything that's returned from that Apex controller and pushing it into matched records.
Thank you very much.
That's basically all I had to show you guys. I blasted through it pretty quick. Did anything not make sense? Does anybody have any questions on how this thing's put together? Makes sense? Yeah. It's pretty simple. It's kind of taking it back to basics, but Lightning's a new framework, so it's kind of nice to revisit these really simple cases to see. It's not learning about a Typeahead as much as it is learning about Lightning.
Are you going to have the code up somewhere where people can look at it?
Sure.
Put it on GitHub.
GitHub?
Yeah. So, see if I can remember my password. So, here's the code. Simple application with one tab. And the tab's in there. The Apex class is in there. And here's all the Lightning stuff in the Aura folder. It's interesting to see this metadata. Each component has its own subfolder in here. That's how the component bundle looks when you retrieve this thing from a developer org. So you can see the event. Pretty simple. And then you can see the more complex autocomplete component. So I'll post the GitHub link in the meetup forum, I guess, if you guys want to check it out. You might be able to just Google search it and find it too.
Maybe a quick question?
Sure.
So maybe in terms of kind of boundary conditions, sort of three sorts of things. One is what happens when there are big, lots of stuff that comes back. The question is, does the framework handle this, or is this your specific code that would handle it? Big long list of stuff that comes back. Then the question of what order it comes back in. And then the third question of, you mentioned async. But if you have a lot of stuff, can you get to see the first window load?
Those are all great questions.
And is that just your code, or?
Yeah, the framework doesn't do much, so you have to handle that stuff in your code.
So you could get a humongous drop-down list.
Yeah, so in terms of the ordering, I just ordered by your search field. This is a simple example, just limits it. One thing you want to do is, since everything in Lightning, all these events, everything is asynchronous, you want to give some nice spinner while these things are loading, which I didn't do, but there's plenty of them in here. I've got some other example code in my GitHub repository from Dreamforce that makes a custom spinner, but you can do something like this while it's loading. So you want to do something good while you're loading a lot of records asynchronously, like this. The other thing is the server side is going to be more scalable. So that's why I did a server side example. In this case, it's a small amount of records, so they both kind of work the same. But if you're searching a database with 1 million records, you're going to want to use the server side one. And you're going to want to make sure that field is indexed and kind of keep your fingers crossed that as you're typing, maybe bump up the minimum characters to 3 or 4, something like that.
Hopefully they're not searching for a 2-letter.
Yeah, so all these types of
Or
considerations.
the timeout or something like that.
Yeah, that's why it's nice to have all those knobs and switches to play with. So by giving all these attributes, you can kind of dial it into your particular situation. Some filtering could be helpful in some cases. The client-side one, it should load 50,000 records. I haven't tested it, but you're going to take the hit up front, so the page is going to be spinning while you load it. But then when you come in here to search these things, they're going to pop up really fast. But those are the trade-offs of the client and server Typeaheads. But yeah, obviously there's a lot of things you have to handle in your own code for these boundary conditions that the framework doesn't necessarily handle for you automatically. Did you have one more question?
No,
That
that was
all
it.
of them?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
I have a question. Did you run into any obstacles that you had not seen with the previous design system that you may have come into with that new Lightning design system?
You mean just the versions?
Well, no, I mean the Salesforce Classic. So,
Gotcha.
is there any new things that you found more difficult or better, easier? What was the difference?
Definitely Lightning. So Lightning design is like pretty much a piece of cake from my point of view. So that's like the kind of the nice part of this whole experience. Very little learning curve, and for developers that don't consider themselves good designers, it's pretty developer friendly. Just copy and paste and it looks great. So that part is nice. But the Lightning component framework is also obviously a big learning curve. So if you're used to doing Visual Force and Apex classes, you can't structure your stuff the same way anymore. You have to learn how to configure your events, how to bubble them up. It's a lot more overhead up front. But the nice thing is your app sort of works cohesively as like a single page application. Everything refreshes when it's supposed to. So once you get it all set up, you're not spending a lot of time debugging like you might, where every condition has to be handled properly, kind of thing. So I would say those are the trade-offs. Lightning design, very easy to use. Lightning components, kind of big learning curve, but sort of worth learning it because once you do, it does a lot for you for free that you don't have to think about.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. How are we doing for time?
Okay,
Good stuff.
5 minutes.
Yeah, I won't focus on that one too much. All right, yeah, so just next time you need to do a Typeahead lookup, just have a look at this repository. Maybe we can get you guys started. File issues or pull requests in here if you feel inclined. I put this together really quickly, so I'm sure there's lots of room for improvement.
Is that set to public?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, thank you.
Thank you.